So good day and welcome to this Astranti financial training video. And in today's video, we're going to work through the industry pack together to make sure you've got all the real world information that you need to succeed at your case studies. So let's get going. Oh, I've gone on too far there already. Let's just zoom back up to the contents page. So obviously in this video, as I've said, we're going to follow through the industry pack. So we're just going to work through it together. I'm going to highlight the important topics for you. So in a second, we're going to begin with just what to expect from the analysis that we uncover. Then we're going to move on to a very brief look at the history. I'm not going to spend too long there, but we will spend longer with the products that are offered in industry relevant to FNG. We'll then move on and look at customers and changing trends in customers, and then look at the marketing. We'll then move on to production and suppliers, stakeholders and CSR. Competitors. Now in competitor, we're going to focus really on Johnston Press. There's other key competitors, but in this pack and this video, I think it's sufficient that we focus on Johnston Press because there's a lot of similarities between Johnston Press and FNG. Brief look at the industry issues, and then we'll look in detail at the industry examples. And the industry examples are really important for you to take away for your case study exam. So before we get going with the main video, we're just going to get talking about how to use this analysis. And I just want to draw your attention to this first paragraph that starts here. In most of the questions, it was hoped that candidates would be able to use industry knowledge and knowledge of the company to help formulate answers. There was little evidence of this. Now, that's taken from an examiner's report marked 2015, and hopefully just goes to show how important it is for you to know real-world industry knowledge and knowledge of the company to help formulate your answers, to give you the best possible chance of getting the best marks that you can. And this is the value that's in this kit and hopefully going to be in this video for you. So the examiners also expect you to have excellent knowledge of the pre-scene and demonstrate it in this exam. And remember, this requirement links directly into your role. Now, you're told in the pre-scene you are a senior manager in the finance function at Finch News Group. You report directly to the board and advise on special projects and strategic matters. And because of this, you expect to provide logical business advice based on issues that are found in the real world. And this is why we make this pack. We want to present you and let you know of the issues that the industry is going through at this moment. And just to draw your attention to a lot of feedback we've had from students who have taken these case study exams before, and they felt the exam was extremely practical, and they wished that they'd spend more time focusing on the case study and the industry and less on revising on theoretical knowledge. So you're doing the right thing. You're watching this video, so you know that the important part is looking at the practical nature of this video. And through this pack, so we've gone on too far there, in this pack, we've gone through the internet, we've gone through journals, we've gone through magazines to bring together all the relevant information so you don't have to. So all you've got to do is read this report or listen to this video, learn the key points, then remember to take them on into the exam. So let's get going. We're going to start with the history side of it. And again, I don't want to spend too long on the history side because I think we're all fairly familiar with the news industry. Now, obviously, with FNG, we're focusing on regional news, so it's slightly different. So let's just draw your attention to this fact to begin with. And in this pack, what you'll see a lot is similarities to the UK market. I think there's only one reference, in fact, in the entire pack to an American example. And that's because there's huge similarities between the UK market and the market in Borland, which is, of course, is the fictitious country where this pre-scene has set the FNG company. And a lot of that similarities stem from the history of both industries in both countries. So let's just bring your attention first of all to this fact that in the UK, the local press is made up of 1,000 papers and 1,700 related websites. In fact, there's a real history of the local press in the UK. In fact, the first one that is still going now started in 1690, the Worcester Postman. That's still in publication now. It's difficult to believe. And although 1,000 papers might seem a lot, actually these are troubled times for regional newspapers. According to the Press Gazette, who are a regional press group in the UK, a press paper, 198 local titles have been shuttered since 2005. So in the last 13 years, 198 titles have closed. And the total circulation of papers has halved. 50.5 million down to 26.6 million. So let's get going with the history. Now, as I've said, there's big similarities between the two. The UK press is slightly older. It began in 1476, slow to evolve at this point because, of course, the population was largely illiterate. The first English daily newspaper was the Daily Courant, and that was produced in 1702. Now, we've already gone too far then. We've already mentioned Barrow's Worcester Journal as being a very old paper that's still in publication, but in fact there's another 20 that started publication in the 18th century and are still going today. And I think that really shows something about the industry. I think it shows what an important role that the local news has in a country. The fact that an entity can survive so long, especially in such a changing world, really shows there must be something that's very core in nature that's really important to the people and important to communities. Newspapers began to get far more common in the 19th century because basically there'd been a tax on the papers beforehand. That was abolished, so more people took it up because it was cheaper. And now we get into modern newspapers in the 20th century. Lots of national papers that are widespread today began in the 60s. The Daily Mail, the Daily Mirror, the Daily Express, the Sun. These are all big papers that are still widely read today. Some of the biggest selling papers in the UK. These were all based in Fleet Street in London. That closed down in the 1980s. In fact, a lot of the papers moved to the Canary Wharf. And that's when we see a move away from the old-fashioned types of printing into computer technology. The legal body of the Press Complaints Commission, was created in 1990. They're really an entity for anyone that has a problem with the press to complain to, and then they're an independent judicial service. And here's something that's gone on to go. Here's something that's worth pointing out. In 2010, now this is a national newspaper, so there's not a lot to compare to FNG, who are regional titles, but just something that we're going to use later on. 2010, the national newspaper, The Independent, was printed in an abbreviated version. It was called The Eye. So it sold more cheaply. It had less pages. It didn't have any of the supplements that are common with broadsheet papers. And really, it was a kind of response to falling readership and changing consumer demands. Maybe people that are more attracted to quick news bites because they've been reading from the internet. We'll come on to that in more detail. I just wanted to flag it to your attention right now. So let's move on. Sorry, I've gone on too far. So let's move on to regional newspapers. And in the latter half of the 20th century, the reading figures of regional newspapers were starting to be hit slowly at first. Between 1945 and 1995, there were 29 to 18 closures, the most of those happening in the 1960s. The evening papers, however, held stable with 76 titles in 1945 and 72 in 1994. In the 1990s, there was a lot of restructuring in the industry. Three of the biggest and regional newspapers, Trinity, Northcliffe and News Quest, started to set up their own websites under This Is brand. Now, they were hoping to capitalise on the nascent internet industry. So what they were doing, traditionally, regional newspapers and newspapers in general have made their money from classified ads. That is, people phoning up and paying to put ads in the papers. Rupert Murdoch called them rivers of gold, as we'll come to later on in this paper. what happened in the 1990s and the advent of the internet was people were starting to stop advertising with the newspapers. The newspapers lost a huge revenue stream, and so in a bid to kind of see this off before it really started, they launched these new websites. And also in the 1990s, consolidation began. Now, this is something we're going to talk of a lot in this pack. So, for example, Trinity took over National Mirror Group in September 1999. Johnson took over Portsmouth and Son in May 1999. Gannett bought NewsQuest. NewsQuest bought Newscom. And it's endless. And what we're going to see a trend of is more and more consolidation as we get through this pack. So, as I've said, they developed an online strategy. A lot of papers, for example, the NewsQuest Title, the Watford Observer, began to have their own websites as a way to try and capitalise on this new internet market. They began to set up companies such as Property Hunter, Job Hunter, Auction Hunter, Auto Hunter. Again, like I say, just to try and capitalise on picking up this ad revenue that until that point they'd had sole control over. They were now losing hugely. So they were trying to set up ways to keep this income streams coming to their business. We're just going to talk more about the adverts coming in. At this point, though, regional newspapers were still doing okay. So this is the end of the 90s. The Leicester Mercury newspaper had profits of 12 million, and the Johnston Press had a profit markup against revenue of 34%. Investors in NewsQuest were offered a 66% return on their investment in June 1999. So what we're seeing here is things are still okay. They're trying to start up websites because they recognize their industry is changing, but what's happening is no one's really realizing the extent of the industry changes. So at the moment, things are still good. We're going to talk about Johnston Press a lot, and they dream of profit markup against revenue of 34% nowadays. And as I said, Rupert Murdoch said the rivers of gold dried up. The industry has significantly changed since then. I've talked about the classified sales ads, and what we're going to see here is a graph of launches and closures. So we can see over the last 5 years, so 2012 to 2017, how closures and launches compare in the regional news industry. So what we're seeing here is 10 titles launched in 2017, but 40 shutting. And you can see it's been dips, peaks and troughs, but actually it looks set to be a downward trend for readership. Again, we'll come to some figures to support that statement in a bit. And of course, if readership's down, then advertisers are going to take their money and use it in a media where they can target exactly the type of consumer they want to attract. They have far more ability to be able to target specific consumer groups than they did just generally in the local newspapers. And in fact, things are so bad in the UK, I've gone on too far again then, sorry, my apologies, that the British Prime Minister Theresa May launched a review in 2018 into the decline of local journalism, seeing it as a threat to democracy, especially in the era of fake news. And again, I talked earlier, didn't I, about how we have papers from the 17th century still in the UK. Now, it's not just as a historical interest, and it's sad that they're dying out. They actually serve a political purpose. What some commentators have talked about recently is community problems. Huge disasters, such as Grenfell Towers in the borough of Kensington, could have been stopped if there had been more community activism. But in fact, that activism and the idea that councils were held accountable was often due to the local press. Now, of course, if the local press closes, no one's holding local councils to account because really the national press is involved in national news. So actually, that's what we're talking about in this comment. This is why it's such a problem for democracy, is at the very local level, unjust things are being allowed to happen. And also what we're seeing, and this is something we're going to talk about a lot, is fake news. This is a huge thing. We're talking about President Trump gets talked about fake news. Well, I think coined the term, or said he coined the term anyway. I think that itself is fake news. Now, people are consuming more information on the internet from unverified sources. What we're used to is actually having, or what people in countries with a strong journalistic tradition are used to, is a skilled profession presenting verified and sourced news stories for consumption. Now anything can be put out onto the internet, and people read it and believe it, partly because they're used to being able to trust their news sources. Again, this is something we're going to come to later on. It's just wanted to raise this idea of regional news actually being something quite important that really affects democracy, because we're going to talk a lot about the bottom line in this video, and I want us to think a little bit past that. Okay, well, before we guys stop myself there, I want to think more about the ethics, because ethics are a hugely important thing that CIMA talk about and question on quite a lot in these case study exams. So this is how it links into that point, and these being a valuable source for communities and countries. So let's go down now. We've talked, we can see how the regional newspaper industry in Borland mirrors that of the UK. It began as very healthy, but since 2017, consolidations and closures mean there are only 360 daily and weekly newspaper titles and 8 national titles left in print in Borland. So we can see their industry seems to have been hit and altered by the same forces that affected the one in the UK. Now, the pre-scene blames these closures on the global recession, the rapid growth of free websites, apps, and global internet providers. And we can see these are the same reasons for the fall of readership in the UK as well. So what we can do here is draw any ideas, draw any conclusions, draw any strategies from the UK market. They should be applicable to discuss the Finch News Group with as well. So now let's move on down to products. And again, there's lots of parallels between the products offered by FNG and those offered by UK companies. And we're normally looking at printed newspaper sales, print advertising sales, digital advertising sales, and contract printing, with a couple of other things as well that we will come on to talk about. So printed newspaper sales. So obviously this is just the money companies make from selling their newspapers. Well, this is a chart that shows the UK regional press circulation in 2017 to 2016, and what you'll notice here is the percentage change doesn't make particularly good reading. I'm just going to highlight that one there. If you notice, they're all downward. DC Thompson is one that stayed stable. The rest are all showing single or double-digit falls in circulation. Now, Johnston Press, I've already mentioned, is the competitor we're going to look at in greater detail. And in fact, what we've got here is Johnston Press with the regional titles, and the +1 is talking about the I newspaper, the paper I mentioned earlier. Johnston Press purchased them about 8 years ago now. And in fact, that's a newspaper that's actually increasing in circulation marginally. So that's I draw your attention to this later on in the video. That could be a subject for acquisition, perhaps for FNG, a daily paper that's designed specifically for the modern reader. And also another way to attract advertisers who are attracted by FNG's national reach. So we can see that makes sorry reading for newspaper circulation. So one expects really sorry reading for the revenues generated by newspaper sales. And I mentioned here, it doesn't seem like a short-term anomaly. And I talked briefly about these figures before, but by the 1990s, we can see that there were 1,687 local newspapers. By 2005, this had fallen by almost a quarter. By 2015, this figure stood at 1,100, which is a 35% drop over 30 years, and with a quarter of those lost being paid for newspapers, because also since the creation of the Metro, which is a paper owned by the Daily Mail, that's a free paper that's offered to commuters. So we now have the paid for press also has the competition of free titles to compete with. And the same research finds that over a small period, only a number of new local titles were launched. Well, we saw that, didn't we, in the graph earlier? The comparison between launches and closures is quite significant. Now, the newspaper industry defends these figures, claiming most of the closures were to free weekly titles, so changing them from paid for to free weekly titles. And in fact, the newspaper closures have been blown out of proportion. But I think we can see the figures there speak for themselves. And I've talked about the IA again, so I'm not going to stick around there, just to say it's much shorter than normal paper. It's tabloid size, and that saves on paper costs. We'll come to the importance of saving on print costs later on, and makes it attractive to commuters, not computers. Computers are part of the problem. They're not going to start reading the paper. And as I said earlier, the IA is the one paper that's performing well in the Johnson Press portfolio. And another product that these regional companies offer are websites and apps. Most publishers offer digital versions of these print titles online. And they're also starting to offer smartphone and tablet apps, because what we see in the infographic below this highlighting, this very wonky highlighting, is how people are consuming the news in this modern era. And we can see, actually, this is comparing digital consumption, not with paper. But we can see that actually people are spending more time on mobile devices now than actually on desktops. So it's really important that companies respond to this and offer apps, which in fact is something that F&G have been slow to do, according to the precinct. So we know that the print circulation is falling. So we could probably guess that advertising is falling as well. And in fact, what we're seeing between 2015 and 2016, combined ad revenue from national news brands fell by 10%. However, this trend seems to be softened because it was 25 million less than the previous year. And now this is a national press, but that trend is expected to carry over into the regional press. So I'll just let you look at this chart. Remember, information like this is an important part of your case study. But we can see it doesn't make particularly happy reading for the regional news brands who are in the red. If I can highlight this correctly, just about highlight that correctly. And in fact, what's really causing this slowdown, what's actually causing this lessening effect, why it's 25 million less than last year, is because, in fact, more money is starting to come from digital formats. In fact, 95% of the money entering the markets come from digital advertising. Now, we might start to think this is good news because, in fact, the UK's digital advertising market also grew by 17.3% to £10.3 billion in 2016. So what we're seeing here is companies starting to have more websites, more smartphones, at the same time as more digital advertising money coming to the market. Unfortunately, for newspapers, nearly all the new money appears to have gone to the US giants Google and Facebook, who together are believed to have made more than $5 billion in UK advertising revenue last year alone. In fact, the total of UK's digital advertising revenue actually going to the regional press actually fell by 3.4% to £193 million. So what we're seeing here is a lot of downward trends. Now, I did say there were other, so I've gone on too far there. I did say there were other forms of income revenue from companies. This is one that's opened by a lot of national newspapers, a lot of regional press in the UK, and also FNG's contract printing. Now, this all started really when obviously the papers were having to go to print, but obviously they were only in, the prints were only in action a certain amount of time of the day. So they started to offer their services when they weren't printing their own titles, and these services have grown. In the case of Johnson & Press, they now offer print management, design, distribution, and subscription services, and even e-publishing options. And in fact, when we come to the finances of Johnson Press later on, we'll see that actually the contract printing is one of the areas that have grown. So that's something worth thinking about when talking about FNG. And an event service. Now, this is something that FNG do not have, but newspaper groups such as Trinity Mirror and NewsQuest offer an event service. Now, Trinity Mirror and NewsQuest are the two biggest regional title publishing houses in the UK at the moment. So this event service involves putting on other companies' awards ceremonies and makes use of the paper's expert advertising and marketing knowledge. Okay, so that's the end of products. We're going to move down now to application to the pre-scene. Now, we've said there's a wide range of similarities and that there's a decline in print in Borland. And the products that are offered between the two are very, very similar. Now, newspapers themselves comes to mind, but what we can see here, as we saw in the UK, is in Borland, the circulation in 2018 is falling compared to 2017 in every area. F&G, as you can also see from the finances in the pre-scene, have not been able to stem their losses of print advertising with digital advertising, and so may have to diversify. Now, I've talked about maybe expanding their contract printing service. Perhaps they're going to do make a purchase of a company like newspaper, or consolidate, as we've seen successful companies do in the UK, or at least the biggest companies in the UK do. And again, I'm going to talk about the I there, which I've done about already. So there we go. Let's move on now to chapter 3. And just before you go, I'd really like to share with you some exciting products that we here at Astranti provide you, that we feel would be really beneficial to make sure that you achieve the highest marks that you can. And the first of these, as you can see on the screen, is the study text. And this will really highlight all the theories that you are going to need for your exams. And we also accompany this study text with course videos. We also provide the pre-scene analysis, which again highlights all the key bits of relevant information that you're going to need to comment on in your case study exam, as well as an industry analysis, which provides real-world information about industries that are relevant to those in the pre-scene. This is something that we've found a lot of students don't really use, and it's reflected in their final marks. We also provide mock exams, and each of these mock exams is created for every level of the case study. And as another service, we provide marking and feedback to these mock exams to make sure that you know you're on the right course before you actually take your exam. And then we also provide masterclasses, which provides you with hints and tips to make sure that you can achieve the best that you can achieve in the exams. And also, we provide the full course offer of a pass guarantee. Now, that's provided, of course, that certain criteria are met. But if you're determined to pass your case study exam, that's the option for you. Thank you very much.